1988, Elvis Presley's personal tailor suddenly broke down in tears while recalling a strange request from the king himself. Elvis once asked him to make 3 identical suits, but they were not all meant for him. Who were the other suits for? What secret was Elvis quietly preparing for? Join us as we uncover this emotional mystery. The man who kept Elvis's secret. He was never the kind of man who took up space in a room. Even in his younger years, when his fingers moved like quick water across silk and wool, he preferred the quiet corner, the careful stitch, the patience of a well-placed seam. Now, at 88, Albert sat exactly where he had always belonged, in the center of a small workshop that the world had long forgotten, surrounded by the things that remembered everything for him. The fabric rolls along the far wall had faded to the color of old paper. The measuring tapes curled at the edges. The photographs pinned above his work table were soft with age, their edges brown, their faces dimmed by time, but unmistakably real. He could name every person in every one of them without looking twice. Some memories, he would tell you, do not fade simply because the photographs do. He was a gentle man, deeply gentle, the kind that made you want to speak more softly when you were near him, as though raising your voice might disturb something precious in the air. He laughed easily and listened even more easily. People trusted him the way they trusted old houses, without thinking about it, without needing a reason. That quality, that quiet steadiness, was exactly why certain people came to him with things they could not take anywhere else. His hands trembled slightly now as he smoothed a piece of cloth across his lap, not from weakness, simply from the years. 88 years of living leave marks on the hands. Small tremors that tell stories the mouth sometimes cannot. He looked down at his fingers for a moment, then up at the mannequin standing in the corner of the room, still wearing a glittering stage jacket that had not been touched in decades. The sequins had lost some of their brightness, but the cut was still sharp, still proud, still his work. On the wall beside the mannequin hung his old sketches, sharp collars, flared pants, dramatic wide-shouldered silhouettes designed to command stages, to catch light, to make thousands of people lean forward in their seats, each one drawn by his hand, each one eventually worn by one man. Albert looked at those sketches the way a person looks at a country they left long ago, with love and with something heavier than love. He changed everything, he said quietly. Not just music. The way a man could stand, the way clothes could speak before a person even opened their mouth. Elvis Presley had not been born needing attention. He had built it, carefully over years. And part of that building happened in rooms exactly like this one. When he first walked through Albert's door, he was already famous in the way that turns ordinary streets into events. But inside the workshop, he was something else. He was a man studying cloth. He moved slowly through the room that first visit, running 2 fingers along bolts of fabric, the way another person might read a page. He pressed material between his palms, held it up to the light, thought about it seriously. He asked questions that surprised Albert, not about price, not about delivery time, but about weight, about how the fabric would behave under heat, how it would move at speed. He wanted to know if the clothes could keep up with him, Albert said, not the other way around. That was the beginning of something that lasted years. Dozens of outfits, hundreds of fittings. A working relationship that, slowly, without ceremony, became more than that. Elvis would linger after fittings, sitting on the edge of the work table while Albert pinned and measured, talking about music with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He talked about the road, about the exhausting, merciless love of an audience, about the strange loneliness of being the person everyone wanted a piece of. Albert listened. He sewed. He kept everything he heard inside the same quiet place where he kept his most careful stitches. He earned that trust, one fitting at a time. Then came the afternoon that Albert still could not fully explain, even now, 7 decades later. Elvis arrived without his usual warmth. He greeted Albert, yes. He was always polite, always that. But something sat behind his eyes that day like weather before a storm. He moved to the center of the room and stood still, which was unusual. Elvis was rarely still. Albert waited. He had learned that some requests needed space before they arrived. When Elvis finally spoke, he spoke slowly, choosing each word as though laying them in a particular order mattered. He wanted 3 suits made, not 2. 3, identical in every way to the stage suit he had worn most recently. The cut, the fabric, the stitching detail along the lapel. Everything reproduced with the same precision as the original. Albert nodded, already calculating the work in his head. A large order, but not impossible. Then Elvis said something that stopped Albert's hands completely. The suits were not for him. Albert looked up from his work table. In all their years together, every single garment he had ever made had been for Elvis's body, Elvis's performances, Elvis's life. The idea of making Elvis's clothes for someone else was like being asked to sign another man's name. Then who? Albert asked. Elvis looked at him for a long moment. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere distant, a car passed on the street, and then there was silence again. He told Albert he would explain everything, but he needed Albert to promise first that what he was about to hear would never leave this room. Albert promised, and for 70 years, he kept that promise. He is only speaking now because the weight of a secret that old, he says, eventually becomes too heavy for one person to carry alone, and because the man who asked him to carry it is long gone. "You keep a secret out of love," Albert said, folding his trembling hands in his lap. "But love doesn't disappear when a person does. It just becomes something you carry differently." He looked at the glittering jacket on the mannequin one more time. Then he looked away. "Those 3 suits," he said softly. "I think about them more than anything else I ever made. The suits that were never meant to be seen." He had always been a man of precision, not the cold, demanding kind, but the warm, careful kind that comes from genuinely loving your work. Albert measured twice before he cut once, not because he was afraid of mistakes, but because he respected the cloth too much to waste it. He was the sort of man who remembered the names of every customer who had ever sat in his fitting chair, who kept a tin of biscuits on the counter for no reason other than kindness, who would stay an hour past closing without complaint if a hem needed fixing. People did not just come to him for suits. They came to him because being in his workshop felt like being taken care of. That was the thing about Albert. He made people feel safe, which is perhaps why, when a secret needed keeping, it found its way to him. He had made dozens of outfits for Elvis by the time that particular order arrived. He knew the man's proportions the way a musician knows a melody, without thinking, without measuring twice. Elvis's shoulders, his chest, the precise length of his arms. It was knowledge that lived in Albert's hands more than in his head. So, when Elvis sat down that afternoon and began describing the 3 suits he needed, Albert's hands reached automatically for his pencil and record book. Then he stopped, because what Elvis was describing made no sense. The fabric had to match one of Elvis's most recognizable stage outfits. The cut, the sheen, the stitching pattern along the lapel, the exact shine of the buttons. Every detail reproduced faithfully, as though the original suit had been taken apart and built again from memory. Albert understood that part. He had done similar work before, but Elvis was not giving him his own measurements. He was describing 3 different bodies, 3 different chest sizes, 3 different shoulder widths, 3 different heights, 3 men, none of whom were Elvis Presley. Albert set his pencil down slowly. "These aren't for you," he said. It was not quite a question. Elvis looked at him steadily. "No," he said, "they're not." The instructions that followed were unlike anything Albert had received in his entire working life. The suits were to be kept completely private. No one in the shop was to know they were being made. They were not to be entered in Albert's record book, the same book that had documented every single garment he had ever produced, every name, every date, a careful and honest account of 30 years of work. For a man who had built his entire reputation on openness, on pride in his craft, being asked to work in secret felt deeply uncomfortable. It was like being asked to whisper when you had only ever spoken plainly. But he looked at Elvis, and he saw something in the man's expression that quieted his discomfort. Not evasiveness, not guilt, something closer to weight. The specific heaviness of a person carrying something they cannot put down. Albert picked up his scissors and began cutting the fabric without writing a single word. Several days passed. The 3 suits took shape slowly on their metal racks, each one a careful echo of the original. Same dramatic lines, same gleaming buttons, same careful stitching that Albert's fingers had learned to produce almost without looking. He was alone in the shop one evening, the front door locked, the street outside quiet, when a knock came. He opened the door and found Elvis standing in the dim light, alone. No driver waiting, no familiar faces nearby. Just the man himself. Collar turned up slightly against the evening air, looking more like an ordinary person than Albert had ever seen him look. Elvis stepped inside and moved slowly along the rack of unfinished suits, touching each one with quiet and unhurried hands. He was somewhere else in his mind. That much was clear. His fingers moved across the fabric, the way you touch something you are trying to remember. Then he spoke, softly, as though thinking aloud rather than explaining. He said that fame built a life that ordinary people could not fully picture, that it created situations, complications, where someone might need to be protected, where appearances had to be managed very carefully, where certain things had to remain invisible to survive. Albert listened without interrupting. He still was not certain what Elvis meant by protected. From what? From whom? Was this about safety, real physical danger? Or was this something quieter and stranger than that? Something about identity or deception, or the impossible cost of being the most recognizable man in any room he entered? Elvis did not say. He simply looked at the suits hanging in the half-light of the closed workshop, nodded once as though confirming something to himself, and said, "They're coming along well." Albert watched him in silence and understood, with the certainty of a man who had spent his whole life reading what people could not say out loud, that he was not going to be told the full story tonight. Perhaps not ever. He locked the door again after Elvis left and stood alone in the room for a long moment, surrounded by 3 suits that were perfect in every detail and explained nothing at all. The man behind the mirror. There are people in this world who give without counting, who helps without needing to be asked twice, who finds genuine satisfaction in the small dignities of their work. A straight seam, a well-matched button, a collar that sits exactly right. Albert was that kind of person, completely and without effort. He did not perform kindness. He simply lived inside it, the way some people live inside music or prayer, naturally, without thinking about it as anything special. He was the sort of man who noticed when a customer looked tired and quietly made the fitting shorter, who wrapped finished garments in tissue paper, even when no one asked, because he felt that good work deserved to arrive well. His workshop was a place where people exhaled, where the noise of the world outside stayed outside. He had built that atmosphere over decades, stitch by stitch, and it showed in the way people sat down in his fitting chair, not tense but settled, as though they had arrived somewhere that was on their side. He never once thought of himself as important. That, perhaps, was the most important thing about him. And it was precisely that quality, that unassuming, bottomless reliability, that made what happened next feel so extraordinary. Because the story that found its way to Albert's small workshop was not a small story. It was the kind that hides inside famous lives, invisible to everyone, except the 1 or 2 trusted people who are let all the way in. The 3 suits had taken weeks. Albert had worked on them with the same unhurried care he brought to everything, even though their purpose remained unexplained. Each one reproduced the original stage costume so faithfully that standing beside it, you would have had to look very closely to tell the difference. Same fabric weight, same precise stitching along the lapels, same buttons catching the light in the same particular way. He had made them without writing a single word in his record book. He had made them without telling a soul. And then, one by one, 3 men he had never seen before came through his door to try them on. They arrived separately, each on a different day, each quiet and unhurried in a way that felt deliberate. Albert helped each one into his suit without asking questions, but as he moved around them with his pins and his practiced eye, something settled over him slowly. A recognition that arrived, not all at once but in pieces, the way a face becomes familiar before you can name it. The hair, the posture, the particular way each man held his shoulders, carried his chin, occupied space in a room. It was not accidental. These men had studied something, or someone, very carefully. They moved with the confidence of people who had practiced being someone else until it felt like their own skin. Albert stepped back from the 3rd fitting and looked at the man standing before him in the glittering suit, and the thought arrived quietly, without drama. These men were meant to look like Elvis. He did not say it aloud. He simply continued his work, his hands steady, his expression giving nothing away. But inside, every unanswered question from the past week suddenly rearranged itself into a shape he could almost understand. Almost. The full explanation came from Elvis himself, during a conversation that Albert had not expected and would never forget. Elvis did not announce it. He simply began talking one evening in the way that people sometimes speak when they have been carrying something alone for too long and finally decide, quietly, to set part of it down. He described what fame had become, not the version that looked beautiful from a distance, the stages, the lights, the roar of a crowd that loved you, but the version that lived inside it, unseen, the version where every airport was a siege, where every hotel corridor could turn into something dangerous if the wrong person found out which room you were in, where moving from one place to another required planning that most people associated with heads of state, not musicians. He could not simply go somewhere. He could not simply be anywhere. His face made every room he entered into an event, whether he wanted it to or not. So he had built a solution the only way he knew how, with careful thought, with trusted people, and with 3 suits made by a tailor who had never once broken his confidence. The lookalikes would appear in hotel lobbies, at building entrances, in public spaces where word had quietly spread that Elvis might be nearby. Crowds would move toward them the way water moves toward an opening, fast, instinctive, certain. And in the beautiful disorder of that moment, somewhere else entirely, the real man would move, quietly, simply, like anyone else. Albert listened to all of this without speaking. He was thinking about the 3 men in the fitting chair. He was thinking about the identical suits on their hangers. He was thinking about how much planning lived behind something that looked, from the outside, like an ordinary order of clothing. Then he thought about something else, something that had nothing to do with logistics. Elvis stood to leave. He paused at the door with his hand resting on the frame, and he turned back for a moment and he thanked Albert. Not briefly, genuinely. He said that there were very few people in his life he trusted completely, and that Albert was one of them, and that this mattered more than he could properly express. Then he said something else, something quieter. He said that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, he wished he could go back to before any of it. Before the name meant what it meant, before his face was a thing that belonged to strangers. He said he missed the feeling of walking into a room and being nobody in particular. He said it simply, without self-pity. The way a person states a true thing they have long since accepted. Then he walked out into the dark street and was gone. Albert stood at the door and watched the empty space where Elvis had been. The night was quiet. The workshop behind him smelled of fabric and old wood and years of careful work. He thought about the 3 suits hanging on their rack, perfect in every detail, built to carry someone else's face into a crowd so that the real man could, just for a little while, belong to no one. They were not costumes. Albert understood that now, in a way he had not before. They were something closer to doors, small, carefully made exits from a life that had no other way out. He stood there for a long time before he finally turned off the light. The last fitting. He had never been a man who spoke about himself. In all his years of working, all the conversations held across the fitting table, all the quiet afternoons spent with needle and thread, and the particular silence of a room where serious work is being done, Albert had always been the one asking questions, not answering them. He was interested in other people the way some people are interested in books, deeply, genuinely, without agenda. He wanted to know how you were, and he meant it. He remembered what you told him last time. He followed up. He cared about the details of other people's lives, the way he cared about the details of his craft, with total, unhurried attention. He was 88 years old now, and this quality had not changed. If anything, age had made it purer. He had no patience left for pretending, and no interest in the performance of kindness. Only the real thing, worn soft and thin from decades of use. Like a favorite cloth that has been washed so many times, it has become something gentler than it started out. His workshop was small. It had always been small, the kind of space that should have felt cramped but somehow never did, because the man inside it made room for whoever entered. The fabric rolls along the walls had faded. The photographs above the work table were touched at the edges by age. His hands resting in his lap trembled slightly in the way of old hands that have worked hard and earned their rest. He was not a famous man. He had never wanted to be, but he had known one, and the knowing had left something in him that he had carried quietly for longer than most secrets are ever carried. He was ready finally to set it down. The last time Albert saw Elvis clearly, with the full sharpness that memory saves for moments it knows matter, was during a fitting that felt different from all the others. Elvis had come alone, as he had taken to doing in the later visits. He stood in the center of the workshop with his arms slightly out from his sides in the familiar posture of a man being measured, and Albert moved around him with the practiced economy of long experience. But something had changed, not in the measurements, those Albert knew by heart, but in the man himself. Elvis was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the kind of tired that settles into a person slowly, over years, the accumulation of too many rooms that belong to everyone but yourself, too many crowds reaching for a piece of something you cannot protect. His smile was present. It was always present, because Elvis was a courteous man who understood what people needed from him. But behind it, visible only to someone paying close attention, was something quieter and heavier. Albert paid close attention. He always had. The suits had done what they were made to do. On several occasions in the months since that strange and secret order had been completed, the lookalikes had appeared, dressed identically, moving publicly, drawing the urgent, loving chaos of crowds who believed with total certainty that they were in the presence of the real man. And somewhere else, quietly, the real man had simply gone where he needed to go. Like anyone, like nobody. The plan had worked. Elvis had found those small pockets of ordinary movement, those brief intervals of being just a person in a street, and Albert understood from the way Elvis spoke about them that they had meant something real. Not freedom, nothing that large, but something, a breath, a moment of the world not pressing in from every side. Yet standing in the workshop that last afternoon, Albert could see that the moments were not enough, could never be enough, because the life that waited on the other side of those brief escapes was still the same life, the same rooms, the same siege, the same smile required at all hours, for all people, without exception or rest. Fame had given Elvis everything the world thought a person could want. It had given him so much, so relentlessly, that there was no longer any room inside it for the things that do not show up in any account of a famous life. Simple things. The feeling of going somewhere unremarkable and being entirely yourself. The freedom of being unrecognizable. The particular piece of a life that belongs only to you. "You've been more help to me than you know," Elvis said at the door, preparing to leave. Albert nodded. He was not a man who deflected compliments with false modesty, but he received them quietly, the way you receive something fragile, carefully, without making a fuss. Then Elvis paused, and in that pause lived everything that followed. He said that sometimes he thought about what it would be like to go back, not to a specific place or time, but to a version of living that was simply smaller, quieter, a life in which a man could walk through an ordinary afternoon and be absorbed into it, invisible, free. He said it without sadness in his voice. That was the part that stayed with Albert. There was no performance in it, no bid for sympathy. It was a simple statement of something true, offered to one of the few people who had earned the right to hear it plainly. Then he shook Albert's hand, firmly, warmly, the handshake of a man who meant it, and walked out into the street. Albert stood at the door and watched him go. The street swallowed him slowly. For just a moment before the car arrived, he was simply a man walking on a pavement in the evening light, and you would not have known, not from that distance, not from that angle, who he was. Albert thought, this is what he wanted, just this small, ordinary moment. Then the car came, and Elvis was gone. He stored the fabric patterns and design sketches from that order carefully, in a flat wooden box that sat on the bottom shelf and was never opened casually. He did not speak about any of it, not because he was ashamed, not because he had promised, though he had, but because the story felt too personal to belong to anyone else. It was not a story about deception or performance or the clever logistics of fame. It was a story about a man, about what it costs to be extraordinary in public every single day of your life, and what you search for privately when the cost becomes too high. Every time he looked at those old sketches, the clean lines, the careful notes in the margins, the measurements for 3 bodies that were not his most famous customers, he did not think about the craft. He thought about the conversation, the door, the handshake, the brief silhouette of a man in evening light who looked just for a second like someone the world had never heard of. Now, at 88, Albert sat in his quiet workshop and let the tears come without embarrassment. He was past the age of performing composure for its own sake. He was not crying for the suits. He was not crying for the craft or the secrecy or the long years of keeping something no one else knew. He was crying for the man who had asked for 3 identical suits and explained, in a voice kept deliberately steady, that sometimes even the most famous person alive needed to disappear. The world had its version of Elvis. Albert understood that version, respected it, knew it was true as far as it went. The stages, the voice, the extraordinary, unrepeatable presence that made audiences feel, collectively, that something important was happening to them. But Albert's version was different. His was the man in the fitting room, the man at the door, the man who shook his hand with genuine warmth and said quietly that he sometimes wished for a smaller life. He wiped his eyes with the back of his trembling hand and looked around the workshop, at the faded photographs, the old mannequin, the sketches on the wall that no one else had ever fully understood. Did the suits give Elvis what he was looking for? Albert thought about this the way he had thought about it for decades, turning the question over slowly, the way you turn fabric in your hands looking for the flaw. A moment of peace, he had decided, was still a moment. Brief and borrowed and bought at some effort, but real. As real as anything else in a life that had very little that belonged only to him. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it had to be.